some secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight for decades. In military circles, call signs are more than just nicknames, they're earned through blood, sweat, and moments that define a soldier's character. But what happens when a decorated colonel discovers that her legendary call sign, whispered in reverence and fear across 3 continents, was born from a moment she never even knew existed? Colonel Sarah Martinez thought she knew everything about her 25-year military career. She had fought in deserts where the sun could kill, navigated political minefields in Washington, and led soldiers through operations that would never see the light of day in history books. Her call sign Phantom 7 had followed her from a young lieutenant to the highest ranks of military command, a badge of honor that opened doors and commanded respect wherever she went. But, on a rainy Tuesday morning in a small cafe outside Fort Bragg, a chance encounter with a retired sergeant would shatter everything she believed about herself and reveal a truth so shocking that it would change not just her understanding of her own legacy, but the way she saw her entire life's work. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we're not even paying attention, and sometimes the ghosts of our past have been protecting us all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. This is the story of how one woman discovered that being a phantom meant more than she ever imagined possible. The morning fog hung thick over Fort Bragg as Colonel Sarah Martinez stepped out of her silver sedan, the familiar weight of her service uniform settling around her shoulders like an old friend. After 25 years in the Army, she could navigate the base with her eyes closed, but today felt different somehow. Today marked exactly 6 months until her retirement, and she found herself noticing details she had overlooked for years: the way the morning light caught the flagpole, the sound of boots marching in perfect rhythm across the courtyard, the smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall. Sarah had always been observant, a quality that had served her well throughout her career. It was this attention to detail that had earned her rapid promotions, commendations, and eventually the respect of soldiers and superiors alike. But it was also what had earned her the call sign that had followed her for nearly 2 decades, Phantom 7. The name had first appeared on official documents when she was a young captain stationed in Afghanistan. Sarah remembered the day clearly. She had successfully coordinated a complex night operation that had resulted in the rescue of 3 captured soldiers without a single casualty. When the mission report was filed, someone had written Phantom 7 in the call sign field, and it had stuck ever since. She had always assumed it referred to her ability to move unseen through enemy territory and her position as the 7th member of her original unit. Over the years, Phantom 7 had become more than just a call sign. It had become a legend. Soldiers would whisper stories about operations where Phantom 7 had appeared seemingly out of nowhere to turn the tide of battle. Intelligence officers spoke of her ability to gather information from the most unlikely sources. Even Pentagon officials knew the name and the reputation that came with it. But Sarah had never paid much attention to the mythology surrounding her call sign. She was focused on the mission, always the mission. Whether she was leading troops through the mountains of Afghanistan, coordinating humanitarian aid in Haiti, or serving on special committees in Washington, Sarah Martinez was known for her unwavering commitment to getting the job done, no matter the cost. As she walked toward the administrative building that morning, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Emily, who was finishing her final year at West Point. "Dad would have been so proud," the message read, along with a photo of Emily in her cadet uniform standing next to a memorial plaque dedicated to soldiers who had died in service. Sarah smiled as she looked at the photo, but the smile was tinged with sadness. Her husband David had died 3 years ago in a car accident, just 2 months before Emily had received her appointment to West Point. David had been a civilian, a high school history teacher who had met Sarah during her brief assignment at the Pentagon early in her career. He had been her anchor, the one person who could make her laugh after the darkest days, who could remind her that there was a world beyond the military where people lived normal lives with normal problems. David had always been fascinated by Sarah's call sign, often joking that he was married to a ghost. "How do I know you're really here and not just another phantom appearing in my life?" he would tease her when she returned from deployments. It had become their private joke, one of the many small intimacies that had made their marriage work despite the demands of military life. Now, 6 months from retirement, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about David and the life they had planned to build together once she left the Army. They had talked about buying a small house near the coast, maybe in North Carolina, where David could pursue his dream of writing a book about American military history. They had planned to travel, to visit all the places they had only read about in books and seen in photographs. Instead, Sarah was facing retirement alone, with only Emily and a handful of close friends to mark the end of a career that had defined her adult life. She had received offers from defense contractors and consulting firms, all eager to capitalize on her experience and connections. But none of those opportunities excited her. The truth was, Sarah wasn't sure what excited her anymore. She pushed these thoughts aside as she entered the building and made her way to her office on the third floor. As the senior logistics coordinator for Special Operations Command, Sarah was responsible for ensuring that elite military units had everything they needed, when they needed it, wherever they needed it. It was demanding work that required constant attention to detail and an ability to think several steps ahead of potential problems. Her assistant, Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, was already at his desk when she arrived, a steaming cup of coffee and a stack of morning briefing documents waiting for her. Torres had been working with Sarah for 3 years, and he had become invaluable to her operations. He was young, maybe 28, with the kind of eager efficiency that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. "Good morning, Colonel," Torres said, standing as she entered. "The morning briefings are on your desk, and you have a video conference with CENTCOM at 10:00 hours. Also, there's been a change in the logistics requirements for Operation Desert Shield. They're requesting an additional supply convoy and air support." Sarah nodded, settling into her chair and opening the first briefing document. This was her routine, had been her routine for years. But, as she read through the reports and updates, her mind kept wandering to the text from Emily and the memories of David. She found herself wondering what her legacy would be when she finally hung up her uniform for the last time. The morning passed quickly, filled with phone calls, meetings, and the endless stream of decisions that kept the military machine running smoothly. Sarah had always prided herself on her ability to juggle multiple priorities and find solutions to complex problems. It was this skill that had earned her recognition and advancement, but it was also what had sometimes made her feel isolated from the soldiers whose lives depended on her decisions. Around noon, Torres knocked on her office door and entered with a worried expression. "Colonel, there's been a situation with the supply convoy for Operation Desert Shield. They've encountered unexpected resistance and are requesting immediate air support. The commanding officer specifically asked for you to coordinate the response." Sarah was already reaching for her phone before Torres finished speaking. This was the kind of crisis that had defined her career, situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for American soldiers. She quickly contacted the Air Support Command and began coordinating a rescue operation, her mind automatically shifting into the focused, analytical mode that had earned her the nickname Phantom 7. For the next 4 hours, Sarah worked tirelessly to coordinate the rescue effort. She spoke with pilots, ground commanders, and intelligence officers, piecing together a clear picture of the situation and developing a plan to extract the convoy safely. It was the kind of work that required her to be everywhere at once, to anticipate problems before they arose, and to make decisions with incomplete information. By 4 in the afternoon, the convoy had been successfully extracted with no casualties, and Sarah finally allowed herself to lean back in her chair and take a deep breath. Torres appeared in her doorway with another cup of coffee and a smile. "Outstanding work, Colonel," he said. "The commanding officer wanted me to tell you that Phantom 7 had done it again." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, but Torres's comment made her pause. Phantom 7 had done it again. It was a phrase she had heard countless times over the years, usually from soldiers who had witnessed her work firsthand. But, for some reason, today it struck her differently. "Torres," she said, looking up at her assistant, "have you ever wondered where call signs come from? I mean, really come from?" Torres looked surprised by the question. "I guess I always assumed they were just nicknames that stuck, ma'am." "Why do you ask?" Sarah shook her head, not sure how to explain the strange feeling that had been growing in her chest all day. "Just curious, I suppose. Sometimes I think we take these things for granted without really understanding what they mean." After Torres left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring out the window at the base beyond. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the courtyard where soldiers continued to go about their duties. She had spent so much of her life in places like this, surrounded by the constant activity of military life, that she sometimes forgot there was another world beyond the gates. Her computer chimed with an incoming email, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from the Pentagon, informing her that she had been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Medal at her retirement ceremony. The medal was one of the highest honors the Army could bestow, recognizing exceptional service to the country over the course of a career. Sarah stared at the email for several minutes, trying to feel the pride and satisfaction that should have accompanied such news. Instead, she felt oddly empty, as if the recognition was somehow incomplete. She had received numerous commendations over the years, but this felt different. This was supposed to be the capstone of her career, the final recognition of a life spent in service to her country. But, as she read through the citation that would accompany the medal, describing her various accomplishments and contributions, Sarah realized that none of it captured what she truly wanted to be remembered for. The citation spoke of operations and logistics, of efficiency and leadership, but it said nothing about the moments that had really mattered, the times when she had made decisions not because they were strategically sound, but because they were right. She thought about the young soldier in Afghanistan who had been separated from his unit during a firefight. Sarah had risked her own safety to find him, not because it was part of her mission, but because leaving him behind was unthinkable. She remembered the family in Iraq whose home had been damaged during an operation, and how she had used her own connections to ensure they received compensation and assistance. These were the moments that defined her, but they would never appear in any official record. As the day ended and the base began to quiet down, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises to manage, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time in years, she found herself questioning not what she had accomplished, but what it all meant. Walking to her car in the gathering darkness, Sarah noticed a group of young soldiers standing near the flagpole, their voices carrying across the courtyard as they shared stories and jokes from their day. She paused for a moment to watch them, remembering when she had been their age, full of certainty and ambition, convinced that she could change the world through sheer force of will and dedication. Now, 25 years later, she wasn't sure what she had changed, or whether any of it had been worth the price she had paid. David was gone, Emily was building her own life, and Sarah was left with a collection of medals and commendations that seemed increasingly meaningless as retirement approached. But, as she drove home through the quiet streets surrounding the base, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important she was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of everything she had experienced. The feeling followed her home and stayed with her as she ate a solitary dinner and tried to focus on a book she had been attempting to read for weeks. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the base settling into its evening routine, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin asking questions about her call sign, about the stories and legends that had grown up around it. Maybe understanding how Phantom 7 had come to define her would help her understand what came next. She had no idea that this simple decision would set in motion a series of events that would completely change her understanding of her own life and the impact she had made on the people around her. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps, and sometimes the answers we seek have been waiting for us all along, hidden in plain sight. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Sarah grateful to be alive, despite the questions that had kept her awake for most of the night. She had decided to begin her investigation into the origins of her call sign by reaching out to some of the soldiers who had served with her during her early years in Afghanistan. If anyone would remember how Phantom 7 had started, it would be the men and women who had been there during those intense months when everything seemed to hang in the balance. Sarah's first call was to Colonel James Bear Patterson, now retired and living in Montana. Bear had been her commanding officer during her second deployment to Afghanistan, and he had always been straight with her about everything from tactical decisions to personnel evaluations. If anyone would have insights into her call sign, it would be him. Sarah Martinez. Bear's voice boomed through the phone with the same enthusiasm she remembered from their days in the field. I heard you were finally hanging up the uniform. About time you got yourself a life outside the Army. Good to hear your voice too, Bear, Sarah replied, smiling despite her serious mood. Actually, I'm calling because I wanted to ask you about something from our time in Afghanistan. Do you remember how I got the call sign Phantom 7? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could almost picture Bear scratching his head in the way he always did when he was thinking carefully about something. You know, Sarah, that's a funny thing to ask about. I remember when that name started showing up in reports, but I never really knew where it came from. I always assumed it was something your unit had given you, but now that I think about it, it seemed to appear out of nowhere. What do you mean? Sarah asked, feeling a strange chill run down her spine. Well, I remember the first time I saw it in an official report. It was after that operation where you coordinated the rescue of those 3 soldiers who had been captured near Kandahar. The mission report came back with your call sign listed as Phantom 7, but I could have sworn that wasn't what we had been calling you before that. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. What had you been calling me before that? I think it was just Martinez, or maybe Eagle 6 since you were coordinating air support. But, Phantom 7? That came from somewhere else, and it stuck so fast that within a week everyone was using it like it had always been your name. After hanging up with Bear, Sarah felt more confused than ever. If her own commanding officer didn't know where the call sign had come from, then who did? She decided to dig deeper, reaching out to soldiers who had served in her unit during that same deployment. Her next call was to Sergeant Major retired Tony Ramirez, who had been her senior non-commissioned officer and had become a close friend over the years. Tony now worked as a security contractor and was known for his encyclopedic memory of military operations and personnel. Colonel Martinez. Tony answered on the second ring. What brings you to call an old soldier like me? Tony, I need to ask you about something that's been bothering me. Do you remember how I got the call sign Phantom 7? Tony was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. You know, ma'am, that's something I've always wondered about myself. That name just seemed to appear one day, and everyone started using it like it was gospel truth. But you were there, Tony. You were part of every operation. If anyone would know, it would be you. That's just it, Colonel. I was there, and I remember everything about those missions, but I can't for the life of me remember anyone actually giving you that call sign. It was like one day you were Captain Martinez, and the next day you were Phantom 7, and everyone just accepted it. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease as she hung up the phone. How was it possible that a call sign could just appear without anyone remembering who had created it or why? Call signs in the military weren't random, they were usually based on specific incidents, personality traits, or skills that had been demonstrated in the field. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Sarah decided to take a different approach. She drove to the small town near Fort Bragg where many retired military personnel had settled, hoping to find someone who might have been involved in the administrative side of operations during her time in Afghanistan. The town of Fayetteville had grown up around the military base, and many of its residents had connections to the army that stretched back decades. Sarah knew that if she was patient and asked the right questions, she might find someone who remembered the paperwork or communications that had first introduced her call sign into the official record. Her first stop was a small cafe called the Morning Briefing, a place that was popular with both active duty and retired military personnel. The walls were covered with military memorabilia, unit patches, and photographs from various deployments around the world. Sarah ordered a coffee and settled into a booth near the back, scanning the room for familiar faces. She was in luck. Sitting at a table near the window was Chief Warrant Officer retired Linda Hayes, who had worked in communications during several of the same deployments where Sarah had served. Linda was in her early 60s now, with gray hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent in challenging environments, but she still had the sharp, alert demeanor of someone who had spent her career managing critical information. Linda Hayes, Sarah said, approaching the table with her coffee. Mind if I join you? Linda looked up and smiled broadly. Sarah Martinez. I heard you were getting ready to retire. Please, sit down. It's been too long. The two women caught up on the usual topics: family, health, retirement plans, before Sarah steered the conversation toward her real purpose. Linda, I wanted to ask you about something from our time in Afghanistan. You handled a lot of the communications traffic back then. Do you remember anything about how I got the call sign Phantom 7? Linda's expression changed subtly, and she set down her coffee cup with a slight frown. Phantom 7, she repeated slowly. You know, that's something I've always thought was strange. I handled all the communications for our sector, and I remember when that call sign started appearing in messages, but I never could figure out where it came from. What do you mean? Sarah asked, leaning forward. Well, normally when a new call sign gets assigned, there's paperwork. There's a request form, an approval process, something that goes through official channels. But, with Phantom 7, it just started appearing in operational traffic like it had always been there. I remember thinking it was unusual, but things were so hectic during that deployment that I didn't have time to investigate. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Do you remember the first time you saw it? Linda closed her eyes and was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to recall specific details from years ago. I think it was in a priority message from higher headquarters. Something about a successful operation that had been coordinated by Phantom 7. But, when I tried to cross-reference it with our personnel roster, I couldn't find any record of that call sign being officially assigned. Did you ever follow up on it? I tried to, but my supervisor told me not to worry about it. He said that sometimes call signs get assigned in the field and the paperwork catches up later. But, as far as I know, the paperwork never did catch up. Sarah spent another hour talking with Linda, but she wasn't able to learn anything more concrete about the origins of her call sign. As she left the cafe, she felt more puzzled than ever. How was it possible that a call sign could just materialize without anyone remembering who had created it or why? Her next stop was the base library, where she hoped to find old operational reports and communications logs that might shed some light on the mystery. The librarian, a civilian employee who had been working at Fort Bragg for over 20 years, was helpful in directing her to the archived materials section. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon poring over documents from her deployments in Afghanistan. She found numerous references to operations she had been involved in, mission reports that mentioned her work, and communications logs that showed the progression of various military actions. But, while she found many instances where Phantom 7 appeared in official documents, she couldn't find anything that explained how or why that call sign had been assigned to her. What she did find was a pattern that she hadn't noticed before. In almost every case where the call sign appeared, it was in connection with operations that had gone unexpectedly well, situations where American forces had achieved their objectives with minimal casualties despite facing significant challenges. The reports consistently credited Phantom 7 with providing crucial coordination and support, but the descriptions were often vague about exactly what had been done. One report in particular caught her attention. It described an operation where a convoy had been ambushed and cut off from support, but had been successfully extracted after Phantom 7 provided critical intelligence and coordination that allowed for precise air support and ground rescue operations. Sarah remembered the operation clearly, but she also remembered that she had been at a different location that day, coordinating logistics for a completely different mission. As the library prepared to close, Sarah gathered the documents she had been reviewing and made copies of the most relevant ones. She was beginning to suspect that there was something much more complex going on with her call sign than she had ever imagined. The evidence suggested that Phantom 7 had been credited with operations and achievements that she wasn't even sure she had been directly involved in. Driving home that evening, Sarah's mind was racing with questions and possibilities. Could there have been some kind of administrative error that had resulted in her being credited with the work of other soldiers? Could there have been multiple people using the same call sign? Or was there something else entirely that she was missing? That night, she called Emily at West Point, hoping that talking to her daughter might help her process what she had learned. Emily listened patiently as Sarah described her investigation and the confusing results she had uncovered. "Mom," Emily said when Sarah finished, "this sounds like something Dad would have been fascinated by. Remember how he always said that history is never as simple as it appears in the textbooks?" Sarah smiled at the memory. David had indeed been passionate about the complexity of historical events and the way that official records often failed to capture the full truth of what had happened. He had spent countless hours researching military history, always looking for the human stories behind the official accounts. "What do you think I should do?" Sarah asked. Keep digging, Emily replied without hesitation. If there's something important about your call sign that you don't understand, then you owe it to yourself to figure it out. Besides, you're retiring in 6 months. What else are you going to do with your time? Emily's words stayed with Sarah as she tried to fall asleep that night. Her daughter was right, she did owe it to herself to understand the truth about Phantom 7, whatever that truth might be. But, she also sensed that the answer, when she found it, might be more significant than she was prepared for. The next morning, Sarah decided to take a completely different approach to her investigation. Instead of focusing on official records and former colleagues, she would seek out the soldiers who had been on the receiving end of Phantom 7's assistance. If her call sign had become legendary because of the impact she had made on specific operations, then, perhaps the people who had benefited from that impact would remember more details about how it had actually happened. She began by reaching out to veterans organizations and online forums where soldiers from her deployments might gather to share stories and maintain connections. Sarah wasn't particularly active on social media, but she knew that many veterans used these platforms to stay in touch with their military families and to process their experiences together. Her first success came from a Facebook group for veterans of Afghanistan deployments. Sarah posted a simple message asking if anyone remembered operations involving Phantom 7, and, within hours she had received several private messages from former soldiers who claimed to have first-hand knowledge of her work. One message in particular stood out. It was from a former Army specialist named Marcus Thompson, who was now living in Texas and working as a paramedic. Marcus claimed that Phantom 7 had saved his life during an operation near Kabul, and he asked if Sarah would be willing to talk on the phone. When Sarah called Marcus that afternoon, his voice was filled with emotion as he recounted his story. "Colonel Martinez," he said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my life in Afghanistan. I was part of a patrol that got cut off during a firefight, and we were pinned down for hours. Just when we thought we weren't going to make it, air support showed up with perfect timing and extracted us. Later we found out that Phantom 7 had coordinated the whole rescue." Sarah listened carefully to Marcus's account, trying to match it with her own memories of similar operations. But, as he provided more details, the date, the location, the specific circumstances, she realized that she had no memory of the operation he was describing. According to her own recollection and the notes she had kept, she had been at a different base that day, working on an entirely different mission. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're saying that Phantom 7 coordinated air support for your rescue, and that this happened on October 15th near Kabul?" "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly right. I'll never forget that date. And I'll never forget that Phantom 7 saved our lives when no one else could get through to us." Sarah felt a cold sensation in her stomach. According to her records, she had been in meetings at headquarters that entire day, nowhere near any active operations. Either Marcus was remembering the details incorrectly, or something very strange had happened that day, something that she wasn't aware of. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that her investigation into her call sign had taken an unexpected turn. Instead of simply learning about the origins of a nickname, she was discovering that there might be a whole side to her military career that she had never been aware of. The question was no longer just where Phantom 7 had come from, it was who Phantom 7 actually was. Sarah's investigation took on a new urgency as she began to realize that the mystery surrounding her call sign was far more complex than a simple administrative confusion. Over the next several days, she received more messages from veterans who claimed to have been helped by Phantom 7 in situations where Sarah was certain she had not been present. Each story followed a similar pattern: soldiers in desperate situations receiving precisely the support they needed at exactly the right moment, always coordinated by the mysterious Phantom 7. The more testimonies she collected, the more convinced Sarah became that something extraordinary had been happening during her deployment, something that someone had been deliberately concealing from her. But, why would anyone want to hide successful operations from the officer who was supposedly coordinating them? Sarah decided to take a more systematic approach to her investigation. She created a spreadsheet listing all the operations where Phantom 7 had allegedly been involved, cross-referencing them with her own duty rosters and location records from the deployment. The pattern that emerged was striking. In nearly every case where soldiers reported being saved by Phantom 7, Sarah had been either at headquarters, in meetings, or assigned to completely different missions. Yet the official records showed that these operations had indeed taken place, had been successful, and had been credited to her call sign. It was as if there had been two different versions of her military service running in parallel, the one she remembered living through, and another one that existed only in official reports and the grateful memories of soldiers she had apparently helped. Frustrated by the contradictory evidence, Sarah decided to reach out to someone who might have access to classified information that could shed light on the situation. She called Colonel Jennifer Walsh, a friend from her days at the Pentagon who now worked in military intelligence and had security clearances that went far beyond anything Sarah had ever possessed. "Jen," Sarah said when her friend answered the phone, "I need to ask you a favor. I'm trying to research some operations from my deployment in Afghanistan, and I'm running into discrepancies that don't make sense. Is there any way you could help me access more detailed records?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding. "Sarah, you know I can't just pull classified files for personal research. What exactly are you looking for?" Sarah explained her investigation into her call sign and the confusing pattern of operations that she apparently had been involved in but didn't remember. As she spoke, she could sense a change in Jennifer's demeanor, as if her friend was becoming more guarded and careful about what she said. "Sarah," Jennifer said finally, "can you come to Washington this weekend? I think we need to have this conversation in person." The tone in Jennifer's voice made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Is there something you're not telling me? Just come to Washington. We'll have lunch somewhere private, and I'll tell you what I can." The drive to Washington that Friday gave Sarah time to think about all the pieces of the puzzle she had uncovered so far. Someone or some group had been using her call sign to coordinate military operations that she wasn't aware of. These operations had been successful and had saved lives, but they had also been conducted without her knowledge or direct involvement. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. Sarah met Jennifer at a small restaurant in Alexandria, far from the Pentagon and the usual places where military personnel gathered. Jennifer looked tired and stressed, with the kind of tension around her eyes that came from dealing with classified information and difficult decisions on a daily basis. "Sarah," Jennifer began after they had ordered their meals, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you goes against my better judgment, but I think you deserve to know the truth about your own career." "Just tell me what you know," Sarah replied, her heart racing. "What I know is that Phantom 7 wasn't really you. I mean, it was your call sign, and you earned it through your own exemplary service, but there was also a classified program that used your identity and call sign for operations that you weren't directly involved in." Sarah felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. "What kind of program?" Jennifer looked around the restaurant nervously before continuing. "It was called Operation Mirror Image, and it was designed to provide deniable support for critical missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. The program used the identities and call signs of exemplary officers to coordinate operations that needed to remain off the books for security reasons." "You're saying that someone else was pretending to be me?" "Not pretending, exactly. The operations were real, and they were coordinated by real military personnel. But they used your call sign and your identity as a cover, so that if anyone investigated later, the trail would lead back to a legitimate officer with an outstanding record." Sarah felt a wave of anger rising in her chest. "So my reputation, my call sign, my entire career, it was all being used as a cover for secret operations?" "Not your entire career," Jennifer said quickly. "Your own service record is genuine and impressive. The mirror image operations were just a small part of what you were credited with. But they were significant operations, Sarah. The program saved countless American lives by providing support that couldn't be delivered through normal channels. Why wasn't I told about this? Because the security of the program depended on compartmentalization. The fewer people who knew about it, the safer it was for everyone involved. Even I only learned about it by accident when I was reviewing classified files for a different investigation." Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what she had learned. Her legendary call sign, the reputation that had opened doors and commanded respect throughout her career, was partially based on operations that she had never actually performed. At the same time, those operations had apparently saved lives and achieved important objectives. "Jennifer," she said finally, I need to know who was actually conducting these operations. If someone was using my identity, I want to know who it was." Jennifer shook her head. "Sarah, I can't give you that information. What I've already told you is more than I should have shared. The people involved in Operation Mirror Image were volunteers who knew they would never receive public recognition for their service. Exposing them now would be a betrayal of their sacrifice. But they used my name. Don't I have a right to know who was representing me?" "They were representing the best of what you stand for," Jennifer replied. "These were soldiers who believed so strongly in the mission that they were willing to remain anonymous so that the operations could succeed. In a way, they chose to be you because you represented everything they aspired to be." As Sarah drove back to North Carolina that afternoon, her mind was reeling with the implications of what she had learned. Operation Mirror Image had used her identity to conduct classified operations, which meant that her reputation and call sign were based partially on the actions of other soldiers. But those soldiers had apparently chosen to operate under her name because they respected what she represented. The question that haunted her was whether she should feel honored or violated by this revelation. On one hand, unknown soldiers had risked their lives using her identity, and their success had contributed to her own legendary status. On the other hand, they had done so without her knowledge or consent, using her reputation to provide cover for operations she had no control over. That night, Sarah called Emily again, needing to talk through her feelings with someone she trusted completely. Emily listened carefully as Sarah explained what she had learned about Operation Mirror Image and the complex web of secret operations that had been conducted under her call sign. "Mom," Emily said when Sarah finished, "I think you're looking at this the wrong way. These soldiers didn't steal your identity, they honored it. They chose to operate under your call sign because they knew that if anyone investigated later, the trail would lead back to someone with integrity and an outstanding record." "But, Emily, my entire reputation is built partially on things I didn't actually do." "No, Mom. Your reputation is built on who you are and how you serve. These other soldiers didn't create your character, they recognized it and chose to associate themselves with it. If anything, this proves that your real impact on the military has been even greater than you realized." Emily's words gave Sarah a different perspective on the situation, but they didn't resolve the deeper questions that were now troubling her. If Operation Mirror Image had used her identity for classified operations, then there might be soldiers out there who had been helped by these mysterious missions. People like Marcus Thompson, who believed that Phantom 7 had saved their lives. Sarah realized that her investigation was far from over. She needed to understand the full scope of what had been done in her name, and she needed to find a way to connect with the soldiers who had actually conducted these operations. If they had been willing to remain anonymous to protect the mission, then they deserved to know that their service had not gone completely unrecognized. The following Monday, Sarah returned to her office at Fort Bragg with a new sense of purpose. She began using her remaining time before retirement to quietly investigate the scope of Operation Mirror Image, looking for patterns in the operational reports that might reveal more about how the program had functioned. What she discovered was that the mirror image operations had been remarkably effective, achieving objectives that would have been impossible through normal military channels. The soldiers conducting these operations had demonstrated exceptional skill and courage, often operating in situations where failure would have meant certain death for American personnel. Sarah also began to understand why the program had been necessary. During the height of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, there had been situations where immediate action was required, but official authorization would have taken too long or created security risks. Operation Mirror Image had provided a way to deliver critical support while maintaining plausible deniability for political and strategic reasons. As she learned more about the program, Sarah began to feel a growing sense of pride in the role she had unknowingly played. Her reputation and call sign had provided cover for soldiers who were willing to risk everything to save their fellow Americans. In a way, she had been serving her country even when she didn't know she was serving. But Sarah also felt a growing need to understand who these anonymous heroes were and what had motivated them to take such extraordinary risks. She began reaching out to more veterans from her deployments, not just asking about Phantom 7, but trying to identify soldiers who might have been involved in classified operations. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sergeant First Class Torres, her current assistant, mentioned during a routine conversation that his brother had served in Afghanistan during the same time period as Sarah's deployment. When Sarah asked for more details, Torres revealed that his brother had been part of a special operations unit that had conducted classified missions in the region. "Would your brother be willing to talk to me about his service?" Sarah asked. Torres looked puzzled by the request. "I can ask him, Colonel, but he's never been willing to discuss his deployment with anyone. He says there are things that happened over there that he can't talk about. Just ask him if he's ever heard of Operation Mirror Image," Sarah said. "Tell him that Colonel Martinez would like to speak with him." The next day, Torres approached Sarah with a strange expression on his face. "Colonel, I spoke with my brother about what you asked. He said he can't discuss Operation Mirror Image, but he wants to know how you found out about it. He also said to tell you that Phantom 7 was the most important call sign in theater, and that he's honored to finally meet you." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Torres's brother had not only heard of Operation Mirror Image, but he seemed to have personal knowledge of it. More importantly, his reaction suggested that he might have been one of the soldiers who had operated under her call sign. "Torres," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, "do you think your brother would be willing to meet with me? I have some questions about my time in Afghanistan that I think he might be able to answer." "I'll ask him, Colonel. But I get the feeling that this conversation is going to be very important for both of you." As Sarah waited for Torres to arrange the meeting, she realized that she was about to come face to face with one of the anonymous soldiers who had used her identity to conduct classified operations. The encounter would finally give her the chance to understand not just what had been done in her name, but why these soldiers had been willing to sacrifice recognition and credit to serve under her call sign. She had no idea that this meeting would not only answer her questions about Operation Mirror Image, but would also reveal the most extraordinary aspect of her military career, one that would change forever how she understood her own legacy and the impact she had made on the lives of the soldiers she had served alongside. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at a small diner outside Fayetteville, a place that catered to local residents rather than military personnel. Sarah arrived early, choosing a booth near the back where she could observe the entrance while maintaining privacy for what she expected would be a sensitive conversation. She had spent the entire week wondering what she would learn from Torres's brother and whether the answers would finally explain the mystery that had consumed her thoughts for the past month. At exactly 2 o'clock, a man in his early 30s entered the diner, looked around briefly, and walked directly to Sarah's table. He was tall and lean, with the kind of controlled alertness that marked someone who had served in special operations. His eyes held the same intensity that Sarah recognized in many veterans who had seen combat, but there was also something else, a warmth and respect that surprised her. "Colonel Martinez," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Staff Sergeant Carlos Torres. My brother Michael speaks very highly of you." Sarah stood and shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Sergeant Torres. I know this might be an unusual situation." Carlos slid into the booth across from her and was quiet for a moment, as if carefully considering his words. "Colonel, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What we're about to discuss involves classified information that I've never shared with anyone, including my own family. I'm only willing to talk to you because I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You owe me?" Sarah asked, confused. "Sergeant, I'm not sure we've ever met before." Carlos smiled, and, for the first time since entering the diner, his military bearing relaxed slightly. "We've never met face to face, but you've been part of my life for years, Colonel. You see, I was one of the soldiers who operated under the Phantom 7 call sign during Operation Mirror Image." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she leaned forward. "You were one of them? You used my call sign for classified operations?" "Yes, ma'am. I was part of a small team of volunteers who conducted operations that couldn't go through normal channels. We used the identities and call signs of exemplary officers to provide cover and deniability for missions that were critical but too sensitive for official authorization." "Why my call sign?" Sarah asked. "Why Phantom 7 specifically?" Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his expression becoming more serious. Colonel, that's where the story becomes complicated, because the truth is that we didn't choose your call sign randomly. In fact, we didn't choose it at all. What do you mean? The Phantom 7 call sign was already in use when we began Operation Mirror Image. It had been in use for months, maybe years, by someone who was conducting unauthorized missions to help soldiers in desperate situations. Our job was to identify this person and either bring them into the official program or shut down their operations. Sarah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. You're saying that someone else was using my call sign before you were? Someone who wasn't part of any official program? That's exactly what I'm saying. There was already a Phantom operating in theater, someone who had access to resources and information that allowed them to coordinate rescue operations and provide support when the official channels failed. We spent months trying to track them down. Did you find them? Carlos shook his head slowly. That's the strangest part of the whole story. We never found the original Phantom 7. Whoever they were incredibly good at covering their tracks. We found evidence of their operations everywhere: successful rescues, perfectly timed air support, critical intelligence that saved American lives, but we could never identify the actual person or people involved. Sarah's mind was racing as she tried to process this new information. So there were two different groups using my call sign? The original Phantom and your mirror image team? Eventually, yes. But, when we couldn't identify the original Phantom, our commanders made a decision to continue using the call sign for our own operations. The reasoning was that Phantom 7 had already established a reputation for successful operations, so using that identity would provide credibility for our missions. But, what happened to the original Phantom? Did they just disappear? Carlos smiled again, but this time there was something almost mysterious in his expression. Colonel, that's what we could never figure out. The original Phantom 7 seemed to know that we were looking for them, and their operations became more subtle after we started our investigation. But they never completely stopped. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? I mean that even while we were conducting mirror image operations under your call sign, the original Phantom was still out there, still helping soldiers in situations where no one else could reach them. It was like they were working alongside us, but always staying one step ahead. That's impossible. How could someone operate in a war zone without official authorization or support? That's what made the original Phantom 7 so remarkable, Carlos replied. Whoever they were, they had access to intelligence, resources, and communication channels that should have been impossible for an unauthorized operator to obtain. They knew things that only senior officers should have known, and they could coordinate support from assets that required high-level clearances to access. Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to understand the implications of what Carlos was telling her. There had been an original Phantom operating under her call sign, someone with extraordinary capabilities who had been conducting unauthorized rescue operations throughout her deployment. This person had somehow managed to remain undetected despite intensive investigation by special operations personnel. Carlos, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Do you have any theory about who the original Phantom 7 might have been? Carlos looked directly into her eyes, his expression becoming very serious. Colonel, we had a lot of theories during our investigation. The most logical explanation was that it was a senior officer who had access to classified information and the authority to coordinate complex operations. Someone who understood the system well enough to work within it without leaving obvious traces. Are you suggesting that I was the original Phantom and just don't remember it? No, ma'am. We investigated that possibility very thoroughly. Your whereabouts during most of the Phantom operations were well documented. You were usually at headquarters or assigned to other missions when these rescues took place. Then, who? Carlos hesitated before answering. Colonel, there was one theory that some of us discussed privately, but it seemed too incredible to take seriously at the time. Tell me. We wondered if the original Phantom 7 might not have been a single person at all. The operations were so diverse, and they required such different types of expertise, that some of us thought it might have been a network of people working together. But, if that were the case, it would have required coordination and communication that would have been almost impossible to hide. Sarah felt a strange sensation, as if a memory was trying to surface from deep in her subconscious. There was something about Carlos's description that seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. Carlos, I want you to describe some of the original Phantom operations in detail. Maybe if I understand what they were doing, I can figure out how it was possible. For the next hour, Carlos described operation after operation that had been attributed to the original Phantom 7. Each story followed a similar pattern. American soldiers in desperate situations would suddenly receive precisely the help they needed, often in the form of perfectly timed air support, critical intelligence, or rescue coordination that seemed to come out of nowhere. As Sarah listened to the descriptions, she began to recognize elements that seemed familiar. Not the operations themselves, but the methods and approaches that were being used. The Phantom seemed to have an intuitive understanding of military logistics and coordination that matched her own training and experience. Carlos, she said during a pause in his narrative, these operations that you're describing, they sound like they were planned by someone with logistics training. Someone who understood how to coordinate multiple assets and resources to achieve complex objectives. That's exactly what we thought. The Phantom operation showed a level of sophisticated planning that suggested military education and experience at a senior level. But they also show something else, Sarah continued, her mind beginning to work through possibilities she hadn't considered before. They show someone who cared deeply about individual soldiers, someone who was willing to take enormous risks to save people who might otherwise have been written off as acceptable losses. Carlos nodded. That's what made the original Phantom 7 so remarkable. Whoever they were, they never seemed to consider the strategic value of a rescue operation. If American soldiers were in danger, the Phantom would find a way to help them, regardless of the cost or complexity involved. As their conversation continued, Sarah began to develop a theory that seemed impossible but also strangely logical. The original Phantom 7 had operated with knowledge and capabilities that suggested senior military training, but they had also shown a level of personal commitment that went beyond normal duty requirements. They had been willing to risk their own career and safety to help soldiers in desperate situations. Carlos, Sarah said finally, I want to ask you one more question, and this might sound strange. During your investigation of the original Phantom, did you ever consider the possibility that they might have been operating without their own conscious knowledge? Carlos frowned, clearly puzzled by the question. What do you mean? I mean, is it possible that someone could have been conducting these operations while in some kind of altered state, or while compartmentalizing their actions so thoroughly that their conscious mind wasn't aware of what they were doing? Colonel, that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. Maybe, but think about it. The original Phantom had access to classified information and resources that would have required high-level clearances. They understood military logistics and coordination at an expert level. They were able to operate in theater without being detected by professional investigators. And they showed a level of personal commitment that went beyond normal duty requirements. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the implications of Sarah's theory. Are you suggesting that the original Phantom 7 might have been someone with multiple personalities or some kind of dissociative condition? I'm suggesting that there might be psychological explanations for how someone could conduct complex operations without retaining conscious memories of their actions. Especially someone who was under extreme stress and dealing with the pressure of making life and death decisions on a daily basis. But, Colonel, if that were true, it would mean that the person conducting these operations might never have realized what they were doing, even years later. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the full implications of her theory became clear. If the original Phantom 7 had been operating in some kind of dissociative state, then they might have conducted dozens of life-saving operations without ever being consciously aware of their actions. The person might have gone through their entire military career never knowing that they had been a hero to countless soldiers who owed their lives to mysterious interventions they couldn't explain. Carlos, she said quietly, I think I need to ask you for a favor. I want you to help me investigate the possibility that I was the original Phantom 7, operating in some kind of altered state that I wasn't conscious of at the time. Carlos stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like awe. "Colonel, if you're right about this, it would mean that you've been living with an incomplete understanding of your own service record for years. It would mean that you're responsible for saving more lives than you ever realized. It would also mean that I've been living a lie, that my memories of my own military service are incomplete or false." "No, ma'am," Carlos said firmly. "It would mean that you're an even more remarkable officer than anyone realized, including yourself. If you were conducting those operations unconsciously, then, your commitment to saving American lives was so deep that it operated even when your conscious mind was focused on other duties." As Sarah left the diner that afternoon, her understanding of her own life had been fundamentally altered once again. The possibility that she had been the original Phantom 7, conducting life-saving operations in some kind of dissociative state, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. It would explain the mystery of her call sign, the grateful testimonies from soldiers she couldn't remember helping, and the strange sense of incompleteness that had been haunting her as retirement approached. But it would also mean that her final months of military service would be spent not just preparing for retirement, but trying to understand and integrate a part of herself that she had never known existed. The journey to uncover the truth about Phantom 7 was becoming a journey to uncover the truth about Sarah Martinez herself. The weeks following Sarah's meeting with Carlos Torres were filled with a mixture of intense investigation and deep personal reflection. Armed with new possibilities about her own role as the original Phantom 7, Sarah began examining her deployment records with a completely different perspective. Instead of looking for evidence of operations she remembered conducting, she began searching for gaps in her memory and unexplained periods where her whereabouts weren't clearly documented. What she discovered was both unsettling and illuminating. There were numerous instances during her deployment where she had several hours unaccounted for, usually during high-stress periods when multiple operations were being conducted simultaneously. The official records showed her as being on base or in meetings, but the documentation was often vague about specific details or exact timelines. Sarah also began to notice patterns in her own behavior from that time period that she had previously dismissed as normal stress responses. She remembered periods of extreme exhaustion that seemed disproportionate to her official duties, times when she would wake up feeling as if she had been physically active during the night despite having no memory of leaving her quarters. She recalled colleagues commenting on her ability to anticipate operational needs with almost supernatural precision, and superiors praising her for insights that she couldn't remember providing. To pursue her investigation further, Sarah made the difficult decision to seek professional help from a military psychologist who specialized in deployment-related trauma and stress disorders. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a civilian contractor who worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and she had extensive experience helping veterans understand and process complex psychological responses to combat stress. "Colonel Martinez," Dr. Chen said during their first meeting, "what you're describing sounds like it could be consistent with a dissociative response to extreme stress. During periods of intense pressure, some individuals develop the ability to compartmentalize their consciousness in ways that allow them to function at a high level while maintaining psychological protection from traumatic experiences. Is it possible that I could have conducted complex military operations while in such a state?" Sarah asked. "It's not only possible, it's more common than many people realize. Dissociative states can actually enhance certain cognitive abilities while suppressing conscious awareness of actions taken during those periods. Military personnel, in particular, sometimes develop these capabilities as a survival mechanism in high-stress environments." Dr. Chen suggested that Sarah undergo hypnotherapy to explore the possibility of recovering suppressed memories from her deployment. The process would be gradual and carefully monitored, designed to help her access memories that might have been compartmentalized without causing psychological harm. During their first hypnotherapy session, Sarah experienced something that she had never encountered before. As Dr. Chen guided her into a relaxed state and encouraged her to focus on specific time periods from her deployment, images and sensations began to surface that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. She found herself remembering nights when she had left her quarters and moved through the base with a sense of purpose and urgency that she couldn't consciously explain. She recalled accessing communication equipment and intelligence systems with passwords and procedures that she somehow knew but had never been officially trained to use. Most vividly, she remembered the intense satisfaction of coordinating successful rescue operations while maintaining complete operational security. Colonel, Dr. Chen said gently as Sarah emerged from the hypnotic state, how do you feel about what you just experienced? Sarah was quiet for several minutes, trying to process the flood of recovered memories. It felt real, she said finally. But, it also felt like remembering someone else's life. I can recall the actions and decisions, but the emotional state I was in during those operations feels completely different from my normal consciousness. That's consistent with dissociative experiences. The part of you that was conducting those operations was still you, but it was operating from a different psychological framework. Probably one that was specifically adapted to handle the extreme stress and responsibility of life and death decisions. Over the next several weeks, Sarah continued the hypnotherapy sessions, gradually recovering more complete memories of her time as the original Phantom 7. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary dedication and capability that both amazed and troubled her. During periods of extreme operational stress, particularly when she knew that American soldiers were in danger and official channels were moving too slowly to provide assistance, Sarah had apparently developed the ability to enter a highly focused psychological state that allowed her to access resources and coordinate operations far beyond her official authority. In this state, she had used her detailed knowledge of military logistics and her extensive network of contacts to provide critical support for soldiers in desperate situations. She had monitored radio communications to identify emerging crises, accessed intelligence databases to gather information needed for rescue operations, and coordinated air support and ground assistance using her understanding of military procedures and protocols. The recovered memories revealed that the original Phantom 7 operations had required not just courage and dedication, but also an extraordinary level of tactical knowledge and strategic thinking. Sarah had apparently been operating at a level of competency that exceeded even her conscious understanding of her own capabilities. Dr. Chen, Sarah said during one of their later sessions, I'm struggling to understand how I could have been conducting operations this complex without any conscious awareness. These weren't simple decisions, they required detailed planning and sophisticated coordination. Colonel, what you're describing suggests that your unconscious mind had access to much more of your training and experience than your conscious mind typically utilized. In dissociative states, individuals often demonstrate capabilities that they don't normally express, particularly when those capabilities are needed to address critical situations. But the risks I was taking, if I had been caught conducting unauthorized operations, it could have ended my career and possibly resulted in criminal charges. That's exactly why your mind compartmentalized these actions. By keeping them separate from your conscious awareness, you were able to take necessary risks without the psychological burden of constantly worrying about the consequences. Your unconscious mind was prioritizing the mission, saving American lives, over personal considerations. As Sarah continued to recover memories of her time as the original Phantom 7, she began to understand the full scope of what she had accomplished during her deployment. The operation she had conducted had saved dozens of American soldiers and had contributed to the success of numerous missions that might otherwise have failed. But she also began to appreciate the enormous psychological cost of operating in this way. The stress of maintaining such a high level of performance while keeping her actions hidden from her conscious mind had taken a toll that she was only now beginning to understand. Sarah decided that she needed to share her discoveries with the soldiers who had been helped by the original Phantom 7 operations. Working with Carlos Torres, she began reaching out to veterans who had been saved by mysterious interventions that they had attributed to her call sign. The responses she received were overwhelming. Soldier after soldier expressed gratitude for rescues and support that had come at critical moments during their deployments. Many of them described Phantom 7 as a guardian angel who had appeared when all hope seemed lost, providing exactly the assistance they needed to survive impossible situations. Marcus Thompson, the veteran who had first contacted Sarah through social media, was particularly moved when she called to explain what she had learned about her role as the original Phantom 7. Colonel Martinez, he said, his voice filled with emotion, I always knew that Phantom 7 was special, but I never realized that you were putting yourself at such risk to help us. What you did, conducting those operations without official authorization, that takes a level of courage and commitment that goes beyond anything I can comprehend. Marcus, Sarah replied, I want you to understand that I didn't make a conscious decision to take those risks. The part of me that was Phantom 7 was operating on instincts and training that I wasn't even fully aware I possessed. That makes it even more remarkable, ma'am. It means that your commitment to protecting American soldiers was so deep that it operated even when you weren't consciously thinking about it. That's not just courage, that's who you are at the deepest level. Similar conversations with other veterans helped Sarah begin to integrate her recovered memories with her understanding of her own character and values. The original Phantom 7 operations hadn't been aberrations or temporary responses to stress, they had been expressions of her most fundamental beliefs about duty and service, manifested in ways that she had never consciously planned or intended. As Sarah's retirement ceremony approached, she found herself with a completely transformed understanding of her military career and her own identity. The call sign that had defined her professional reputation was indeed earned through her own actions, but in ways that were far more complex and extraordinary than she had ever imagined. The ceremony itself took place on a crisp morning in early spring, with colleagues, friends, and family gathered to honor her 25 years of service. As she received the Distinguished Service Medal and listened to the citation describing her contributions to military operations around the world, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion that had been missing from her earlier anticipation of retirement. But the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Carlos Torres and several other veterans of Operation Mirror Image approached her after the official proceedings. They presented her with a small, privately made plaque that read, "To the original Phantom 7, in grateful recognition of service above and beyond the call of duty, conducted in the shadows so that others might live in the light." Colonel Carlos said as he presented the plaque, "This represents the gratitude of all the soldiers whose lives you saved, including those who will never know how close they came to not making it home. You gave us the chance to return to our families and continue our lives, and we wanted you to know that your service will never be forgotten." Emily, who had traveled from West Point to attend the ceremony, stood beside Sarah as she accepted the tribute. Later, as they drove to the retirement reception, Emily asked her mother how she felt about everything she had learned about her service as Phantom 7. "Honestly, Emily, I'm still trying to process all of it," Sarah replied. "Learning that I was conducting life-saving operations without conscious awareness has changed how I understand myself and my capabilities. But it's also given me a sense of peace about my career that I didn't have before." "What do you mean?" 4 months before I started investigating my call sign, I was struggling with whether my military service had really made a difference. I had medals and commendations, but I wasn't sure that any of it had actual meaning. Now I know that I saved lives in ways that I never could have imagined, and that knowledge gives my entire career a significance that goes beyond any official recognition. "What are you going to do now?" Emily asked. Sarah smiled as she considered the question. "I think I'm going to spend some time learning to integrate all aspects of who I am, both the conscious officer who followed procedures and protocols, and the unconscious phantom who was willing to break rules to save lives. Both of those parts of me are real, and both of them contributed to my service. And maybe you can help other veterans who might be struggling with similar issues. If you were able to operate at such a high level while dealing with extreme stress, there might be others who have had similar experiences but don't understand what happened to them." As they arrived at the reception, Sarah realized that Emily was right. Her experience as the original Phantom 7, and her subsequent journey to understand what had happened during her deployment, had given her insights that could be valuable to other veterans who were struggling to make sense of their own service experiences. Standing in the reception hall, surrounded by the colleagues and friends who had shared her military journey, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that her investigation into her call sign had taken. What had begun as a simple curiosity about a nickname had become a profound exploration of her own identity and capabilities. She had learned that being Phantom 7 meant more than she had ever imagined, not just because of the legendary status the call sign had achieved, but because of the depth of commitment and sacrifice that it represented. The Phantom had indeed been real, and it had been her all along, operating from a place of such deep dedication that it transcended her conscious understanding of her own limitations. As Sarah looked ahead to her retirement years, she knew that she would carry the full truth about Phantom 7 with her, not as a burden or a secret, but as a source of strength and purpose that would guide her into whatever came next. She had spent her career serving others, and now she understood that service had taken forms that were more extraordinary and meaningful than she had ever realized. The Phantom was finally visible, and Sarah Martinez was ready to embrace all aspects of who she had been and who she was becoming.